Okay, so here's the first video that is going to be about prehistory. And I want to keep in mind, want you to keep in mind a couple of things. Like number one, if you feel like things are going too fast, don't forget you can pause the video and you can use your notes while you're going into this. And I recommend that you have a piece of paper and you write down some questions that you may have or any ideas that you think are really, really important as you watch the video. And I'll come back on at the end and talk to you about a couple of key points and what are the main things that we want to get out of the video that you're about ready to watch on our prehistory notes. Okay, the first unit and the first part is on how humans have changed, and we'll watch that right now. Bye bye.
To our lesson on prehistory. This is from chapter one, and today we're going to talk about the origins of all this. And I have a really spooky face to start us off with. Of course, all this is tied to the SOLs, and we're going to be talking about the Paleolithic era and how people moved from being hunter-gatherers to uh, eventually settling in civilizations. But the big things that we want to get out of today are how the earliest people were heavily, heavily impacted by their geographic environment and what this meant for hunter-gatherer societies. And we're also going to talk about the traits that hunter-gatherer societies developed because of this.
Picture yourself in a boat
Okay,
on
so we're
a
talking about
river with
prehistory.
10.
Oops. What the heck does this have to do with prehistory? Are you kidding me? The Beatles? What? Well, of course, the Beatles. The song is named after, a skeleton. Well, the skeleton is named after the song. I guess I got to get that right. And the truth is that this skeleton was the most complete skeleton found of a species called Australopithecus, a an early forerunner of humans, or a hominid. A hominid is any human or its ancestor. And Australopithecus afarensis is what Lucy was. I have a video on the website that is a link that shows you the difference between Lucy and apes and the difference between Lucy and humans. Also, what their similarities were. And the biggest thing is that Lucy's hips were designed so that she walked upright. Now, some of that could have been for a lot of reasons, including, the grasslands where she lived, again, the geography affecting things. But Lucy is the most complete skeleton found up to that time of an Australopithecus. She's very handsome, isn't she? So, what's all this mean, and what are we talking about? We're talking about how humans got better and got smarter and evolved. Australopithecus is, 3.2 million years ago. Now, there are some videos that you're going to see online that suggest that some of the forerunners may have been standing on 2 feet even a million years before Lucy. So it's some pretty interesting evidence. Then we're going to talk about how humans evolve. And if you notice on the pictures, the brains get smaller and the jaw lines get smaller. Okay, so Homo erectus, which is sort of like the first of humans, and by the way, there are several other different versions of humans that come in between here. For example, Homo habilis came between Australopithecus and Homo erectus, and we think that Homo habilis, or person with ability, came up with fire. All right. Eventually, though, we're going to move to Homo sapiens, and the first Homo sapiens that we know about, anywhere from 200,000 years ago to 150,000 years ago, are Neanderthals. And we'll talk more about those later. And then you have Homo sapiens sapiens. Those are modern humans from about 40,000 years ago to the present. Now, the first Homo sapiens sapiens that we'll talk about later are Cro-Magnon. Okay, so let's talk about hominids. First, the definition. Hominids are humans and other creatures that walk upright on 2 feet. Or, as I like to say, all humans and their ancestors, or their homies. Homies, get it? Okay, I know, another bad joke. All right, and the first that we talked about was Australopithecus. These are the first hominids that are thought to have emerged in East Africa, right along the Great Rift Valley, which we'll talk about later on, between 3 and 4 million years ago. And then we have Homo habilis, which is another step up, meaning handy human, and eventually to Homo erectus. And we think all of that happened between 2.5 to 1.6 million years ago. Homo erectus, very handsome as well. Okay, this is sort of the second stage in early human development. And we know that they were walking upright. Okay, so the first hominids to leave Africa and move to Europe and Asia, scientists believe that was Homo erectus. They are also some of the first humans, or their ancestors of humans, to use complex tools. Okay, so how do we know about this stuff? Well, we're talking about the science of archaeology. Okay, so what do archaeologists study? They study past societies through the analysis of what people have left behind. So what are some examples of things left behind? Well, those are artifacts. Artifacts are things that people made, and here are some examples. Tools and weapons, art and sculpture, pottery, jewelry, human remains. Boy, it's sad when they leave those behind. And some of the ancient buildings and monuments. Archaeologists study these things. Now, fossils, which they study, are the remains of ancient plants and animals, things that were alive. If something was organic, it means it was alive at some point. By studying the fossils, archaeologists and anthropologists can learn what people ate and what animals they had around and their ways of life. Now, what are some of the ways that we date artifacts? Well, probably the most popular form is carbon dating. Carbon dating can date back objects through the use of a radioactive isotope of carbon that's called carbon-14. And all things that are organic absorb this from the sun while they're alive. And so then when they die, carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,000 years, which means it takes 5,000 years for half of the carbon in carbon-14 to break down. So we know how much carbon is left. We can count back, and we can pretty much do, limit things. There's a limit on it, somewhere around 50,000 years. But we can use some other guesses with some other things too, like relative dating. And that doesn't mean that you're dating your sister, just saying. Okay, it means that we can do things like date back things based on objects that are buried in the same level of sediment. And we use things, since they were buried in the same sediment, we assume that they were in the same time period. Now, how does carbon dating work? Let's check this out. The cosmic rays of the sun bombard the atmosphere, and you get a carbon dioxide carbon nitrogen exchange, which is passed into the plants through carbon dioxide and photosynthesis. The photosynthesis then begins a carbon dioxide exchange with the ocean, and I'm just making all this up because I had a really pretty picture and I wanted to show you guys. Okay, well, we'll move on. Okay, so the Paleolithic period. Paleo means lithic. No, paleo means old. Lithic means stone. So you put those together, and what do you get? The Old Stone Age. This is the largest era of human existence. And it's called the Stone Age because for the most part, the tools and weapons that were used during this time were made from stone. Now, how did people get their food? Mostly by living in small groups called clans. And they were all hunter and gatherers. Everybody's job was to find food, and that's all you did.
Be very quiet. I'm hunting rabbit.
Yeah, when you're hunting rabbits, you got to be very, very careful and very, very quiet. So, here's some things and traits that the hunter-gatherer societies had. They were nomadic, which means they wandered from one place to another in search of food and shelter. They invent the first tools. These were simple tools from stone. So stone tools are the second trait of nomadic societies. They lived in small groups called clans. About 20 to 30 people were in a clan. Now, at first, they didn't use shelter. They just used holes or whatever they could to stay alive. But eventually, they will move into caves for shelter. Eventually, they're going to learn to control and make fire. This is huge because they're able to stay warm and to cook their own food. Now, we're not sure how the first fire was invented. It could have been a lot of things, but some people say rubbing sticks together or rocks, but the most likely scenario is that lightning struck, and eventually humans learned to control that. They will also develop oral or spoken language. They were grunts and groans, but hey, they knew what they meant. Oh, yeah, oh, like that. Okay, well, you get the idea. Okay, now, also, they started to make cave art and statues. Now, this is what is interesting. Women and men had very different roles, but they were still the same in some regards. The role of men was to hunt, usually in groups. The role of women was to gather and care for children. Now, what's interesting is that early on, many of these traits were basically, for lack of a better term, the hunter-gatherer part, the hunter part was not as successful as the gathering. So women had a great deal of power in these ancient civilizations. Okay, so again, here are your traits. They're nomadic. They invented the first tools and weapons from stone. They lived in groups called clans. They learned to make and control fire, and they developed oral or spoken language, and they made cave art. So on your notes, what I want you to do is tell me which one is most important and rank them 1 through 6, and then write a brief explanation of why you picked the ones you did and put them in the order that you did. Okay? All right, so let's review this once again. What is the primary tool of the Paleolithic period? Oh, you say it's the rock? Hey, yeah, the rock.
Do you smell what the rock is cooking?
Oh, so it wasn't that rock, was it?
Oh yeah, not this type of rock.
Yeah, it wasn't that type of rock either, was it? Oh, I know, it was... Cool. Alright, and remember, this rock was everything. It was every tool. It was a Swiss Army rock. And just because they had tools didn't mean they knew how to use them. I wouldn't do that, Thorg. I know how to use this thing. Okay, so they used fire, and they learned to adapt to their environment. Okay, and like we said, it was probably through, lightning. Now, later on, the Ice Age is going to hit, and man will use fire to survive that. Also, their bodies will adapt too, which is what we'll talk about with Neanderthals and those type of things. Now, remember that cave art was an expression of what they did there every day. It may have been for religion. We don't know. There are some signs that people started to bury bodies and do those types of things. But certainly cave art reflected what they did their daily lives. It's sort of like a journal of what happened to them. This is the ability to adapt. And that is what allows humans to survive. The fact that they can take their environment and use it to make themselves sufficient enough to survive. Now, what do we know at the end of this? Where did the first hominids develop? Well, you should be able to figure that out. Okay, what are some ways that archaeologists study prehistory? What are some of the traits of hunter-gatherer societies? And analyze why women may have played a more dominant role in early societies. Now, I've got a couple of other questions for you too. Think about this. Why did the environment play such a huge role in early people's lives? Okay, that's the end of this video. We'll move on and go from there.
Okay, so after watching the video, make sure that you answer the questions, jot those down on paper. Make sure that you've written some questions to help yourself out. And then please, please make sure that you followed along, fill in your notes where you think you are. And remember, the notes ask you to do activities. So put those ideas together, read the questions carefully, and then we'll discuss some of your answers tomorrow in class.